Okay, I think we are good to go now. So thank you very much to all of those attending. Firstly, let me introduce myself. I am Jim McGrath, IFA's Director of Commercial Policy, and we're delighted that you were able to join us for the event of enhancing the value of medicines through the reimbursement process with our key guests that I will introduce in a moment. The format of this meeting is that two of our guests will give presentations. A panel discussion will then follow. However, we would encourage you to put questions into the chat, the Q&A chat function in Zoom. You can do this dynamically through as people are presenting, and we will come to the questions during our Q&A session below. Our aim is to have this as interactive as possible, so we would please encourage you to do that. I'll just give our full panel. I will introduce first. Katrina Duggan is the chair of the Irish Pharmaceutical Healthcare Association Market Access Advisory Forum, which obviously monitors and discusses all matters reimbursement on behalf of IFA. And she is also the country manager for Amgen here in Ireland. Secondly, we have Sandra Redmond, Managing Director of Salutum Insights, and we have Jason Fair, Senior Director of Pharmacy Advisory Services with Optum, broadcasting to us from City of Washington, I believe, Washington, D.C. So thanks very much with that, and I will proceed now to invite Sandra to give her presentation to this event. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for that introduction. My name is Sandra Redmond, and I am Managing Director of Salutum Insights. Salutum Insights is an Irish-based consultancy company that specialises in all types of health economic research, including health technology assessments as part of the Irish reimbursement process. We're a team of 5 now, consisting of health economists, analysts, and medical writers. And I am a health economist by training myself. I have been in this industry now for 16 years, 13 within a company and 3 within Salutum Insights. So have been there since the start of the official reimbursement process in Ireland. And I feel like it's a really good time to be talking about value beyond the traditional incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or ICER, and the budget impact, because there's a lot of positive energy around the pharmaceutical industry at the moment on the back of the development of the COVID-19 vaccines. And I know it's really positive because my friends and family now ask me what I do and whether I'm involved in these vaccines. And prior to COVID-19, they had no clue what I did, and I was regarded as the Chandler Bing of our group. So it's a really positive time for us, and a good time to be talking about value beyond costs. And I'm going to start with an overview of the statutory reimbursement process in Ireland. I'm aware that there are people online who are not familiar with this, so I'm just going to briefly go through it. There are 4 main stages in the reimbursement process. There's horizon scanning, and that's simply a form that has to be submitted each year to notify the authorities of what's coming. And then following CHMP decision, all medicines are subject to a rapid review, which is assessed by the National Centre for Pharmacoeconomics. And they make a recommendation to our health authorities, known as the HSC, on whether to reimburse a drug, whether more analysis is required in the form of a formal HTA, or whether further engagement with a company is required to secure reimbursement. And if that's not successful, then a HTA is required. And usually the further engagement involves price negotiations. And then if a HTA is required, then that is also assessed by the National Centre for Pharmacoeconomics, and they make a decision, they make a recommendation to the HSC on whether to reimburse, whether to engage further with the company, usually on price, sometimes on number of patients. And I suppose the formal decision is made by the HSC itself. The HSC drugs group makes a recommendation, and then the HSC leadership team rubber stamps that recommendation. So it's a lengthy process in Ireland. If a HTA is required, it takes about 2 years before patients get access to a medicine. If a HTA is not required, but further engagement is required with the company, then it's about a year. And then if there's no engagement, no HTA, it's about 5 months to access. And we are recognized as being a country that's slow to make our medicines available to patients below the EU average. And I suppose the other thing about our statutory reimbursement process is that there is a lot of focus on the incremental cost effectiveness ratio and the budget impact. The threshold in Ireland is €45,000 per quality. Anything above that and above 5 million requires HSC leadership sign off. And then if you have to engage further with the HSC, that's usually on the basis of price, with the intention of reducing the budget impact and getting the incremental cost effectiveness ratio as close as possible to this 45,000 per quality threshold. So a huge focus on cost in our reimbursement process, and that's not unlike other processes. So it was really great to see this report published a couple of weeks ago. It is the WiFOR report, and it looked at the wider socioeconomic benefits attached to medicines. It looked at medicines in 3 disease areas: cardiovascular disease, cancer, and respiratory disease. And it examined the reduction in years life lost and years life lost due to disability as a result of the introduction of these medicines over 25 years, attached the average industrial wage to these years, and came up with a value of 51 billion. And that really brought home the message that there are people at the end of these medicines that do want to contribute to society and through the economy, and actually do that. And then that got me thinking about the Health Act and the other factors that are included in the Health Act that are that are involved in the decision-making process by the HSC. So cost effectiveness, budget impact, and comparative effectiveness are assessed by the National Centre for Pharmacoeconomics. But there are other factors at play in terms of the reimbursement decision, and these include clinical need, safety, and availability. And I like to think of these pieces of information as Black Swan pieces of information. I don't know if you've ever seen a Black Swan, but if you have seen one, you really do a double take, and it kind of changes your perspective of things, because you would have thought that all swans were white. And in terms of negotiations, Black Swan pieces of information are those pieces of information that take the heat out of the negotiations, that can tip the negotiations in your favor. And it is a term coined by Chris Voss in his book Never Split the Difference. And this really resonated with me not because I think that sometimes we're in a hostage situation when we're negotiating with the HSC, but I suppose I've used those Black Swan pieces of information to good effect throughout the years in engagements with the HSE. And it takes the focus away from medicines being a cost, and it looks at other factors of medicines that bring value. And I'm just going to go through 3 examples briefly. So the first example was a triple inhaler medicine for a COPD. And at the time, Ireland had the highest COPD hospitalization rate in the OECD. And the COPD clinical program at the time had an aim to reduce the number of COPD hospitalizations by 1,500 per year. And the market was characterized by lots of different medicines for COPD and lots of different inhalers that varied in their difficulty of use. So there was a lot of confusion, and the medicines management came out then and recommended an inhaler that promotes compliance and reduce confusion. And this triple inhaler really did this. And this spoke to the kind of health needs of the public, and we use this to great effect in getting this over the line. The next example is a medicine for cancer, an oral treatment for end-stage blood cancer. It was these patients have 10 to 12 weeks to live. The medicine increases survival, but also there was a possibility of a cure. And so the combination of those 2 factors really spoke to the HSE's national cancer strategy of survival being in the top quartile of in the EU by 2025. And it really spoke to the clinical need aspect of the Health Act. And this got over the line as well. And this was a treatment for assisted reproductive therapy. And I suppose this one was one close to my heart, because when we did the research for this area, we found that the market was highly unregulated. So women are in this highly unregulated market, pay a lot of money for ART, and the market then also was characterized by supply issues, because most of the medicines were unlicensed in this area, despite the fact that the HSE recommended usage of unlicensed medicines where possible. So we really focused on the availability in this reimbursement submission, and we got this one over the line. So to conclude then, it is a good time to talk about medicines beyond their cost, and these are kind of Black Swan pieces of information, like I like to call them, and they benefit the company, the HSE, and of course patients. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and I look forward to asking you a lot more about Black Swans, and you might tell us all the many ones you've come across in your time so far. That was very interesting and very thoughtful and insightful. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Jason Fair, who it's his breakfast time, or quite early in the morning in the US, of Optum Insights, to commence his presentation. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Jim. Sandra, if you don't mind stopping sharing real quick, and I will pop up my slides. Perfect. Thank you. Can everybody see my slides?
Yeah, we can see that. That's great, Jason.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Fair, one of the senior directors here in the Optum Pharmacy Advisory Services team. As Jim mentioned, I am based in the US, part of an actuarially focused multidisciplinary pharmacy advisory team. My team is based in the US, but I also lead the international efforts for our group in concert with the 1,500 Optum Advisory Services folks that are there in Ireland. We aim to serve life science, plan, government, pharmacy benefit managers as it pertains to the US, as well as a number of different entities. And I just, thank you for inviting me today and for having me on. And there's probably some folks here saying, well, this is an Irish focused presentation. Why are we talking about the US? And I think it's important to point out that drug development doesn't happen in a country specific way. Although some of you may argue that it's very centric to the US. And I certainly, after 17 years in pharma before I came over here, I can certainly understand why it looks that way. But ultimately, development costs and the development process affects a global population. And I think there tends to be a focus, and we take a focus of the financial stakeholder. And you'll see kind of why in a little bit. And we'll talk about some of the translation to the Irish market. As I mentioned, I've been in healthcare for over 20 years. I've spent almost 17 years in pharma with Boehringer Ingelheim, where I did payer strategy, payer marketing. I actually managed a portfolio of products at one point worth about $1 billion. And I grew up in that sales organization, and over time I've come to realize that there's a decision-making process that was going on, and it was not being addressed appropriately, and that that involved a stakeholder that I'll talk about a little bit, and I'm going to spend a little bit of focus on. But before I do that, I want to just give a little bit of background for those of you who maybe have US in your portfolio, or have maybe a gap that you want to help fill today, which is why you came. The US contains three general, what we call books of business on the healthcare benefit side. You have the commercial, which is typically an adult population and encompassing also children. It's typically provided by employers through health plans, and it represents typically a working age member, is what we call them. Medicare, which is our aged health plan, begins when you get older or you become disabled, and provides your benefits. It's heavily government subsidized and regulated through the federal government. And then you have Medicaid. Medicaid is our program for socioeconomically challenged citizens, and is a combination of state management and regulation, as well as federal oversight and funding. So you have a mix there. The one thing I want to call out, and there are a couple of others as well, but the three big buckets relate to commercial, Medicare, and Medicaid. The important thing to note about this is what none of these entities do is own, from a healthcare perspective, a person from birth to death. And I think that is a huge difference, and frankly, it's a driver in the value proposition that healthcare resources, and in particular medicines, provide. In this case, there's no one entity that owns healthcare from the time you're born until the time you die. If you look at the percentage of insured lives, so right, taking those three big buckets and then kind of breaking them down, it's about 57% commercial, largely provided through employers, but administered by health plans, and in concert with pharmacy benefit managers. Then you have Medicare, which Medicare itself has two different components: a fee-for-service component, which is also called traditional Medicare, and then you have what's called Medicare Advantage, which is more like commercial benefits, and it's administered through the same companies that would provide commercial coverage, like United Healthcare, for instance. And they do have Medicare benefit packages. And then you have Medicaid, which, as I mentioned, also has two components, fee for service as well as a managed Medicaid, and then uninsured. When looking at formulary design and how plans evaluate whether or not they're going to pay for a drug, and it's a little bit of a it's complicated, right? That's the simple answer. It's complicated. We can't cover it in the short time that we have, but there are you can get access to products through a number of different ways. There are different opportunities to add a product to a formulary. The major steps that a plan, or in a Medicaid or in a Medicare setting called plan sponsor, would go through is, they evaluate their previous formulary, they set their objectives for what they're trying to do, and oftentimes these are done a year to 2 years ahead of time. With Medicare right now, they're starting to think and plan for 2023, and by this fall, 2023 Medicare formal Medicare planning will have kicked off, which just gives you a little bit of a sense of how far that goes. Commercial's a little different, but evaluating your previous formulary, and in particular the performance of that formulary, what the member response was to your formulary, whether that's good or bad, and how the drug use compared to how it was previously modeled. You also take into account what's new, and the what's new is a really important one today. Innovation is in terms of pharmaceutical and medical benefit drugs is, in my opinion, just at a great pace. It's a huge pace. There's a lot of good that's being done for a global population. We're finding curative therapies for things that we never could have. I could never have imagined. And I think the next through my lifetime at least, I'm excited to see what comes. That innovation and what pharma, and I consider myself still pharma, what we consider innovation, whether that's a new indication, a new therapeutic area, a new the gene cell therapies, these innovations, these things are risks to a payer. And the risk is disrupting a budget that's already been established and a utilization pattern that they're already familiar with, and the corresponding financial impact of that. And so I spend a lot of time working with actuaries, and we'll talk about that just in a moment, but they have a very interesting tagline for the Society of Actuaries, and as risk is opportunity. If you think about it, all that innovation, and I love innovation. My background's prevention, so I love things that impact big populations. And in reality, that comes with a pretty hefty risk for those that have to pay for it. And I think that's a really important concept, because it translates not just from the US, but it also translates into a single payer market. These modeling those decision scenarios is another big part of it. Looking at forecasting net plan cost, and doing it in a way that probably differs a little bit from how we think about it in pharma terms. And then, of course, there's an element of dialogue that happens between providers and patients and the plan as they're thinking about making some of these formulary challenges or formulary changes. That's not a Freudian slip. To talk about how might a provider and or patients react to certain changes. That dialogue is usually held with a limited number of folks, and they tend to be it's a fairly small group, and it happens periodically. The process itself, and for those who aren't familiar, right? So it's often led by the pharmacy director. They're in concert with the medical director, and it's a multi-step process. It's very it may go through a few cycles where the medical and pharmacy directors, along with a few select others, and you typically a subject matter expert, will get together. They'll sit down and talk about the clinical profile, the safety, the efficacy, X financials, and they'll make a decision. And those decisions tend to come in three categories, and they're called different things, but essentially it's must add, meaning must add to the formulary, may add, and do not add, meaning that there is no way that the product should be on a formulary. If you want to think about that in terms of the breakout, less than 10% of products are a must add, meaning that the clinical, the safety profile, the unmet need that they address are such that at any cost, the product should be on the formulary. May add, which is obviously the biggest category, opens up a whole lot of discussion around, right? At that point, it tends to focus on the economics. And then you have a very small group, which is do not add. And it's very rare that something like that happens, but it is another classification. Take that to the next step. So, right, the pharmacy and the medical director, along with their P&T colleagues, have gotten together. They've decided and have been through that process, also talked about if they're going to restrict the access to that product, meaning we want it on our formulary, but we want to restrict access, or we don't want it on the formulary and we're going to restrict the access. What clinical criteria would we put in place, and how effective can we be? Because a plan would spend resources, spend money to put the program in place, the steps in place in order to restrict. So even keeping a product off of a formulary does cost money. That flips to another committee, and it's one that pharma is typically never aware of and definitely not involved in. It's behind the closed doors. We call it a business impact committee. It's got a number of different terms, but I think business impact committee tends to be a fairly recognizable term, and it includes a stakeholder at this point that certainly is very important and is not typically addressed, which is an actuary. Actuaries, from an insurance perspective, are required to sign off on the premium. To do that, they do a tremendous amount of modeling. And at the end of the day, what the plan is trying to do with all of this is incorporate the cost of the formulary and the formulary changes into what it wants to charge for premium. That said, the actuaries tend to do a lot of the modeling. They are the ones who after the very, very effective clinical and safety, or the safety, the efficacy discussions, the clinical profile, these are the folks who are consumers of information, right? That are making these financial decisions. They go round and around. The pharmacy and medical directors say, yeah, this is a drug we would like to have on the formulary. What will it cost? The actuaries go model it, come back and say, this is what it will cost. Does that fit in the established budget that you're trying to meet? And it's kind of wash, rinse, repeat until everything fits. And part of that process involves going back to the manufacturer, negotiating rebates. Why do I give you this level of detail? Because I think it's important to understand that it's a process that repeats itself very often for products. But if you think about your own market and what the process is for evaluating medicines and how decisions are being made, we do a phenomenal job as an industry in addressing the clinical merits, the innovation, bringing value, right? Value to society. But in my experience, and what drove me to spend so much time with actuaries is the way that they look at the financials, the way that they're calculating the costs and the returns, This is a stakeholder that is not being adequately addressed. And are you thinking about it even in drug development? Are you addressing the endpoints, the value points that somebody like an actuary would pick up on and go, I get that. They tend not to be clinical. I do work with one physician who is also a credentialed actuary. We call him Neo because he's the only one that we're aware of. But this is a stakeholder that we focus on because we believe that it's a key to success and often not heard from and not addressed. So talking, carrying that forward, what do actuaries care about? Just a few things. This is not, this is just a few points here and there. Some would say, yes, we do. Some would say, no, we don't. But just as a little bit of a teaser, right? So things that right now, virus outbreak costs, everyone's worried about spend. In the US, and I saw a report yesterday, there are some regulations around how much a payer has to pay in claims costs in a year relative to the premium that they collect. They've collected a whole lot, and because of the pandemic reduced utilization, now they're having to pay back billions of dollars to their members because claims weren't submitted, resources weren't used. So virus outbreak costs are hugely important. Baby boomers aging into Medicare creates an interesting situation. You have the oldest and sickest commercial members aging into Medicare. They become the youngest, healthiest of their cohort, changes the dynamic, also skews numbers. And so that one's of keen interest. And then you have immigration and migration for a lot of different reasons. Those are really interesting points, even in lockdown. Pharmacy, there's a whole lot of things in pharmacy, and we could spend hours and hours talking about it. It's the innovation piece. That is the part, the pace of things coming, rare orphan conditions being addressed that frankly, some of them don't even have ICD-10 codes, which is a really important point. And overall, the total cost of care is a big one, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. Legislative, if there's one thing I've learned over the last few years, it's how involved actuaries are in monitoring the legislative landscape. And the rationale is because every time a piece of legislation is passed, it tends to trickle down and have an impact on how they price premium. So let's talk about value and evidence for just a second. This is the last slide. When we talk about ICER, and I think about ICER in terms of the organization ICER in the US that publishes reports. ICER reports are talked about in a couple of different lights. If you have a product that gets a really bad ICER report, payers will leverage that to say, this is why you need to pay us more rebate. So there's value there. If ICER report comes back and shows very favorable results for your product, plans will tend to go, yeah, it doesn't really qualify. So, and there's actually been some studies published on that. So ICER here is still an evolving tool to help develop formulary strategy. Pharma's interaction with the ICER organization and how they report is growing. I hear more and more every day. The challenge really comes down to the value of a quality adjusted life year. It's not directly applicable to a US payer, going back to the beginning, because nobody owns a member's health from birth to death. And that's so an investment for me as a commercial payer today, knowing that a member will only stay with me for a few years, the return on that significant investment today is probably going to be garnered by my competitor or somewhere else where they won't return on the dollar. Where HEOR and from manufacturers effectively leverage this platform being HEOR to engage with a US payer it's where they're allowed to, and where they've found the right mix of commercial support and medical knowledge, so that the economics, and really bringing it together to provide that comprehensive view to a payer. And the way I've seen it done, and I hear quite a bit, is somebody's either very economic or very medical, and the ones that have a good marriage of both, because of the interpretation of risk in communication with a payer. Sometimes that's a little bit, you're not able to communicate effectively across both of those, which is how a plan wants to do it. I always tell people, ask yourselves the question: who uses the results of what you're doing? What decisions do the people that you're engaging with, do they make? What are their value drivers? And what analytic methods do they use? Thinking and talking like the stakeholder you want to influence is a big part of it. I go back to the actuaries and say, we've done a poor job to this point. The ones that are doing it effectively, we find are faring pretty well. Yeah, and when it comes down to RWE, and this is a constant topic, especially with my international clients, at least from a U.S. payer perspective, and I would argue that any payer, single or otherwise, would only believe the data that comes from their own membership, and that is the ultimate RWE, and the ultimate use of that RWE, and the greatest value is being derived through value-based contracts. That's it for me. Jim, I'll turn it back over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jason, for, I suppose, what quite comprehensive outlay and very interesting workings in the US market, which of course is very different here. We will now open it up to the panel discussion. And again, I would say for any of their participants attending, don't be shy. We would welcome your questions and inputs. So without further ado, Katrina Duggan, Country Manager of Amgen and Chair of IFA's Market Access Advisory Forum. I suppose, firstly, I want to come to you to ask, what would be your key learnings and takeaways from both presentations, as someone who is an active practitioner in this market and someone looking to bring innovative medicines all the time?
Thank you, Jim. Let me check that you can hear me okay, first of all.
Maybe, yeah, we can hear you okay.
You can hear me okay. So thank you, Sandra and Jason, very interesting. And I certainly didn't know a lot about the US market. I can't say I know an awful lot more, but a little bit more enlightened. Jason, thank you very much. So I think from Sandra's presentation, I really appreciate her optimism, but I actually also share her optimism. You know, I think it's an extremely positive environment that we're working in now. We've certainly had many years of frustrations, but I think the release of funding this year has absolutely aided things. But more so, you know, it's not just, I mean, the funding is a critical issue in terms of driving the timelines that Sandra shared with us. But I think it's much more so about how you can take control within the access, particularly around the negotiations. So, you know, there's delays throughout the whole process, as Sandra has shared with us. We interface with the CPU, as we all know. So it's what can we do at that level to really broker the negotiations. And I think Sandra shared some very nice examples of what you can do beyond the ICER, beyond the budget impact, and really trying to find that sweet spot around the willingness to pay. And as I said, you know, I definitely would share some of her examples there, past experiences, which has aided us to getting over the line. In Jason's presentation, it's really interesting, Jason, you know, the fact that one entity owns healthcare from birth to death. And, you know, you can see how the systems are so different, our system versus the US system, because the HSE owns healthcare from birth to death. So for us, you know, you would say ascertaining value is actually an easier, whereas it's a much greater challenge for you. And I think the actuarial focus is very interesting because they certainly don't sit within our process. You know, our process is very much about the clinical and cost effectiveness of the drug. So you've actually provoked my thinking into where are the actuaries within our system? You know, do they sit within public expenditure? Do they sit within Department of Health? And perhaps that's where we can leverage the WiFOR report. So those were my kind of key takeaways, Jim.
Very good. And just to that, based on your experience to date, do you think there is much, or does anything beyond the ICER or the quality really matter to our payers or assessors, or how important is just the numbers?
Yeah, so I mean, they are obviously key. The ICER is key to getting you through the HTA and to enable decision making. But sometimes you actually have to shelve the ICER if it's just really going against you, and find other things within that willingness to pay threshold. So we've certainly had experiences here, and I would certainly agree with Sandra in the whole area of cancer care. You know, where we're bringing treatments that show incremental gains on previous treatments. So in one instance, we were able to just take it out of that whole survival related to our drug and look at what has been the incremental gain within this disease area over many, many years. And the example I used was multiple myeloma, because we were able to show that 15 years previous to these innovative treatments, 2 out of 10 patients survived beyond 5 years. Whereas where we had come to, we were now reaching a 6 to 8 out of 10 patients alive after 5 years. So that was really important, because that fed into the National Cancer Strategy. So that's one distinct example. And I think one of the other key leverages is, where do you displace costs within the system? Which is also a very important criteria for the payer. And if you can show that you're displacing something for something that is a lot better and it's going to give a lot more gains, then it's usually a really good argument to base your negotiation on.
Very good. Sandra, I'll come across to you. I think everyone in the pharmaceutical and reimbursement business is in the or is doing their best to on a daily basis chase their various black swans. I suppose from your experience in Salutum, what are the types of black swans that you come across most frequently, and what do you believe truly moves the payer beyond the basic ICER?
I think the one black swan piece of information that truly moves the payer is the clinical need. And in all submissions and all engagements, we would always focus on, well, why do we need this drug? Why do patients need this drug? So that's the one, from my experience, it's the clinical need. It's what drives or moves the payer. But then in some instances, supply is an issue. And it's not only in the reimbursement of new medicines, but they're very conscious of supply constraints and patients not having a medicine, because that gives them a big headache. So supply was surprisingly a big issue as well when I was going through the drugs for this presentation. But clinical need really is the one that stands out. And Katrina talked about the sweet spot, and the sweet spot in relation to clinical need was always when we spoke to clinicians and who are involved with these patients day in, day out, and they are able to succinctly tell us why they need this drug, what a patient looks like, and what would their life be like after this drug. So yeah, the sweet spot or the black swan moments are always the clinical need.
Okay, and just you sort of based a good bit of your presentation on the WiFOR report. Would you have any, a strong opinion as to how much of kind of the reduction that medicines achieve through years of life lost or years lived without disability, how much you can truly attribute the value to a medicine, or do we need to attribute that value to much more factors than that? And, clinician input, diet, lifestyle, even socioeconomic background in some instances.
Well, I suppose the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, by its nature, it takes into account extra years life gained, and it's kind of it's switched on its head in the reimbursement submissions, and it takes account of years life due to disability in terms of the quality as well. And it varies then. So we are required to report them, but it varies by disease area. So say if you had a vaccine for a childhood disease, the life years gained is can be huge and can be fully attributed to a medicine. But then you have a medicine for cancer, and there may not be a huge gain in years, but the quality of that life may be very valuable. So it depends on the disease area, and we are required to report it within the reimbursement submissions. But the difference is that we don't attach, we only include the health benefits. We don't attach the wider socioeconomic benefits, and that's the difference between us and our submissions and the WiFOR report.
Yeah. And again, you know, I think a lot of health jurisdictions are grappling with this question of the weight or the value of criteria beyond the ICER, the quality, or beyond the numbers. So I put it to you, what do you believe is the appropriate weight that we should put to the cost effectiveness as a medicine, and how would we weight other factors, or should we weight other factors along with that, and if so, by how much?
I don't know if we have enough time to discuss this. This debate has been going on for 20 or 30 years, whether the quality is an appropriate measure to quantify all the benefits attached to a drug. Like, it only includes the health benefits, that's correct. And it assumes that everyone's going to gain equally from the medicine. And of course, that's not true. And I suppose it doesn't take into account, formally take into account other factors such as severity of the disease, innovation, and those factors. But if you look at the Health Act, those factors are taken into account in the decision-making process. It's not formalized, or neither is there a weight attached to the other factors beyond the ICER. And I suppose that is a huge exercise, and every country has been grappling with this. Like the NICE at the UK shelved it a couple of years ago, and I don't see it happening in Ireland in the next couple of years until a few other countries kind of move on this. We're generally not a first mover country when it comes to new concepts and methods.
Exactly. That's a nice segue over to you, Jason. We're definitely rarely first movers in these types of issues in this country. But I suppose I do want to put it to you, you know, what's very different in this market is we do have a single dominant payer for the most part, or at least covering at least about 85% of the pharmaceutical market or thereabouts. We do have small initiatives and things like value-based contracting or outcomes-based reimbursement, but nothing on a wider systemic scale, and probably not a lot of actuarial thinking. On that basis, is there something that the US system gains in your experience that the Irish system is missing out on currently?
And if you're asking it in relation to value-based contracting specifically, it's my belief that value-based contracting is the ultimate partnership, and it's also the ultimate demonstration of clinical value and economic effect. And so that opportunity is what's gained where it's being taken advantage of. The challenge there is that it is labor intensive. There is infrastructure that needs to go into getting there. But if I think about innovation and I look at the innovations that are being brought to the market by the pharmaceutical industry right now in particular and over the last few years, we're not talking about Me Too drugs anymore. We're talking about truly innovative things that have very, very large impacts for the patients that that are impacted by them, right? That are helped. To be able to demonstrate in a real population, right? So going back to that RWE, demonstrating within a population and everybody on both sides having skin in the game, meaning, you know, there's dollars at risk on both sides. I think that is the opportunity, because if the innovations that we're providing truly are bending the cost curve on medical resource, on health resource utilization, then you've achieved a total cost of care benefit for an incremental spend on one side to be saved over on another side. And I think this is fundamentally maybe what's missing in the conversation or in the calculations. There are some silos that go up. We have them in the US. Pharmacy benefits are typically evaluated as pharmacy benefits, and the cost offsets associated on the medical side are typically calculated by somebody else and or owned by someone else. And so actuary over here is calculating pharmacy, actuary over here is calculating medical, and not often do these two get together and say, hey, I'm willing to give up a little bit of budget over here so that you can save a whole bunch over there. That conversation isn't happening as often as possible, but value-based contracting, when it's done with medical benefit in mind, is what brings that together. So that would be an opportunity.
Great. And I suppose to that point, what are the types of infrastructure that are needed to generate the information from which you can hang those contracts, knowing it is widely acknowledged that data infrastructure would be a particular weakness of the Irish system? Yeah,
and that is the big one, right? Because why would I take on risk as the government entity that's administering the benefit without a very clear understanding of even what my costs are within the different buckets, having a well-coordinated set of data and a consistency of that data. I mean, ICD-10 is a common standard, right? But are we pairing that together with pharmacy claims, right? That it's a data issue, and then it's people having having that innovative mindset to say, we understand why the value of investing today benefits us for years to come. And I love the WiFOR report. I was on the call a few weeks ago when it was rolled out to this group, and I love what it stands for, because you're talking about the impact at a very, very important level. I think the challenge there on the spend that's going to take to make an effective case here for value-based contracting, et cetera, is to get the people who are making decisions and who own different pieces that ladder up to that to understand.
Mm-hmm. And tell me, as these types of contracts were developed in the US, was there much, the resistance to change from payers wouldn't be a uniquely Irish phenomenon, but what were the types of barriers that would have been encountered with payers in the US?
Yeah, and let's be clear, value-based contracting, although very attractive and you see lots of press releases, they're not widespread. They are challenging to administer, because it does take an investment upfront in order to gain. It does take time to see the clinical effect of a change to manifest itself in the claims, in the outcomes, right? And everything is judged on claims. Claims are a financial document or a financial transaction that we use as a proxy for clinical impact or clinical effect. It's not perfect, but it's what we have to measure. And so, I don't know if I have a perfect answer for you on that, but yeah.
No problem at all. No, thanks a million. I suppose, Katrina, to to bring this back to, I suppose, the nuts and bolts of what IFA and our membership are kind of striving for, do you see the potential for value-based contracting or contracts to evolve in a different way in this market here over the short to medium term?
Yes, the short answer there is yes, Jim. You know, if we are to continue with this process, the P&R process as is, then I think we do need to start to deploy. And in fact, I would say on an individual level, companies are already doing it. But some of the hindrances that we have are, you know, the whole data infrastructure. And I think that's one thing. If we want to enable something like value-based contracting, we have to find a way to enable that data infrastructure so that we can have shared common goals and really underline the value and show the value of our medicines within that short, medium, long term.
Mm-hmm. And Sandra, just to develop that a bit further with you, would you see risks to the payer in this instance, or is it something that can be done in a way that delivers very tangible benefit to the payer?
Value-based pricing,
Yes.
you mean? I think it's taking the risk away from the payer, because you're proving that your medicine works in the same way as clinical trials. And in most cases, in some cases, in some studies where this has been looked at, it has been proven. So it takes a little bit of, it takes the risk out of it, in my view. And it really kind of lends itself to the value beyond medicines being a cost. But as Katrina and Jason said, it's a huge administrative burden on the health system. 10 years ago, we were gung-ho about these value-based pricing, like other countries, and they were kind of put on the back burner then because of the huge administration burden, especially on clinicians who have to record outcomes. So if you can get technology that would record that, I think that would be a huge advancement in that area, and we do see some of that coming through now. So I'd like to see more advancements in that area.
Mm-hmm. And maybe Jason, to come to you with that, how could we present a case to the payer here that investing in the infrastructure is in your long-term interest and in the long-term financial interest, as opposed to investing in a lot of infrastructure that might just prove you are achieving value for money as it is?
Yeah, the fear of spending a lot today and not getting a return, I think all you have to do is model other countries that have put the data infrastructure in place, and it really is important to have that data, because if you can't see it, you can't take the risk out of the investment in the medicine, and then measure that return on the investment. You know, I think the best way to do it is to take some model cases of countries who have, or areas where that investment has been made. Certainly not a short process. It's a painful one, right? Because data is garbage in, garbage out, and so just because you put systems in place doesn't mean that what comes out of them would be usable. But you have to start somewhere. I mean, it's a foregone conclusion that they'll need the data at some point. I think bringing some thought leadership together with, you know, the government to say it's not an if, it's a when, and how do we get there, and how can we collectively partner to get there for the greater benefit? Because at the end of the day, you have an opportunity to bend the trend on total cost of care, and that's a buzzword, but I truly believe it captures the spirit of what we're all trying to do with innovative medicines.
Great, thank you very much. with that, we are just up in our time. There wasn't any questions from our participants, which I'm choosing to interpret that they understood everything perfectly clearly and didn't need any aspects of it clarified, and found all the content of your presentations completely riveting. So thank you. So firstly, thank you very much to all of those who attended. It's greatly welcome. This is one of many discussions we are going to have on the topic of the value that medicines drive for society. I think it's at the very core of what IFA and our membership try to do, and it is not an easy topic to get our heads around, to fully understand, to fully measure. So the more learning we can generate from each other, I think that sees fit. So with that, to the panel, Jason, thank you very much, and we'll let you back to your breakfast in the States. Sandra, thank you very much as well, and to Katrina Duggan, thank you also, and best wishes with all the work with Amgen. I think that's all from us now. So firstly, I might just say both Jason and Sandra and their organizations, I'm sure, are open to contacts for anyone that's interested in exploring any of these topics further. And of course, we in IFA are always open to assisting. So thank you very much. We'll let everyone go back to your lunch. It's been great.
Thanks, Jim.
Bye.
Bye-bye.